Good morning, guys, and welcome back to our Tuesday, May 12th video lecture. Today we're going to be talking about the Ronald Reagan presidency here on the Homefront. Let's go ahead and get right on into it. So, the shining city upon a hill. Ronald Reagan liked to think of the United States as simply that, a shining city upon a hill, a phrase adapted from a sermon by a man named John Winthrop, founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Winthrop hoped that the colony would become a model Christian society or a city upon a hill that would serve as an example to the world. In his farewell address, Reagan said this: "The past few days I've thought a bit of the shining city upon a hill. In my mind, it was a tall, proud city, God blessed and teeming with people of all kinds, living in harmony and peace, open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here." Kind of a beautiful sentiment about the United States, really. And it makes sense when we look at his immigration policy. We're going to talk about that at the very end of today's lesson. So, social programs. Reagan, as a conservative, not surprisingly, wanted less spending on social programs. That's been a pillar of the conservative platform for a very long time. So it's not unusual that Reagan was a strong proponent of those ideas. So Reagan, as his other conservatives, largely opposed government spending on social welfare, believing that social programs stifled personal initiative and produced a dependence on government aid, trapping people in a cycle of poverty. At Reagan's urging, Congress slashed funding for many of Lyndon Baines Johnson's anti-poverty programs, including food stamps, federal aid for the elderly, the poor, and the disabled. Other cuts targeted student loans, subsidized housing programs that helped low-income families pay rent. Again, much of this came about during LBJ's Great Society legislation in the mid-60s. So destroying the safety net. One of the real tough aspects of these conservative economic policies was the effect that it did have on those living below the poverty line. Right? It was very, very harsh in many inner cities, what many families went through. Cuts severely affected single women with young children, as well as young adults with few job skills and little education. The number of children living in poverty grew by 25% during the 1980s. The amount of homeless people also increased dramatically. Now, you can think positively or negatively, or really just be very neutral about Ronald Reagan. But that statistic is something that should be very alarming. I mean, 25% poverty growth during the 1980s, children living in poverty, that's a very, very startling number. Okay, next slide. Another issue that was beginning to take hold on the home front during the 1980s was the HIV/AIDS epidemic. The United States had faced this grave health crisis. This disease attacked the immune system, hindering the body from fighting illness. Many AIDS patients die from infections like pneumonia that their weakened immune system simply cannot fight off. That's what made AIDS such a scary disease, was that it weakened you to even things like the common cold could cause severe problems. Many of the first AIDS cases in the United States were among gay men, fostering the mistaken belief that AIDS was largely a gay disease. This idea allowed the disease to spread much further and much more rapidly than epidemiologists anticipated, because there was this idea that it was confined to one community within our society. Okay, moving on to the next slide, you can see images from HIV/AIDS protests, a chart there showing the rapid increase in deaths, and then decrease in deaths as well from the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Unfortunately, it's still a disease that's with us to this day. Inaction leads to deaths. At the end of Reagan's first term, there were over 8,700 confirmed AIDS deaths in the United States. 4 years later, that number had grown to over 46,000 AIDS deaths. That's a very, very large number. Again, this should sound similar to today with the coronavirus outbreak. Right? AIDS activists urged Reagan to address AIDS and fund research for the disease initiatives that the president, quite frankly, resisted. By the end of the second term, Reagan finally addressed the AIDS crisis, declaring it public health enemy number one. Still, he dedicated little effort to fighting the epidemic. Okay, next slide. Just say no to drugs and DARE. I actually had personal experience with the DARE program when I was a little kid, kindergarten, first, second, third grade. I actually attended many of these DARE presentations. They would come to your school, they would present the information. I remember one time my dad was actually involved with one of them. My dad was a detective, so he came into the school and he talked about it. And, it was kind of like a bring your dad to work, or rather bring your dad to school kind of thing. I remember it. Now, like AIDS, drug-related violence in the inner city neighborhoods was also a concern in the 80s. Drug-related crime was way up in the 80s. With his wife, Nancy, the president initiated a Just Say No media campaign, urging youths to just say no to drugs. This is the start of what becomes known as the drug war. The Reagan administration also funded a drug education program called Drug Abuse Resistance Education, DARE, or the DARE program, which sent police officers to schools to teach students about the dangers of drug use. Like I said, I remember sitting in on a few of those when I was younger. Drug use on the rise. Reagan's advisors lauded DARE as a success, citing studies that indicated reduced drug use among high school seniors. However, longer-term studies conducted in the mid-1990s concluded that the program had little or no effect. In addition, critics of Reagan's drug intervention policy cited studies showing increased use of cocaine among urban, poor, and minority youths. So even though there is this large investment in trying to help young people with drug abuse and drug-related violence, the fact of the matter was the program just didn't really accomplish what they wanted it to. Now, although many conservatives supported educating students about the dangers of drug use, these conservatives opposed government programs that provided treatment for drug addicts. So really, it's a half measure, right? You're trying to keep people from becoming addicted to drugs, which is fantastic. You should have that outreach. But the second part of the equation is how to help those that are already addicted, right? So when you approach it from just one end, it can be hard to get your arms around the full situation. And that's what our government dealt with in the 1990s and even into today as well. So Reagan and immigration, our next slide. Another focus of Reagan's domestic policy was immigration reform. Now, this is what Reagan said of amnesty. Many Republican voters today would not support Reagan's idea of amnesty. However, it was a fairly popular idea among the Republican platform in the 1980s. This is what he said. I believe in the idea of amnesty for those who have put down roots and lived here, even though some time back they may have entered illegally. So instead of trying to deport illegal immigrants, for those people that had been here for some time, he wanted to create a pathway for those individuals to citizenship, right? They had invested their work, their money, their lives into our society and felt that keeping them here was more valuable to us than trying to kick them out. Again, not sure many Republicans today would support amnesty But Republicans in the 1980s certainly did. And Ronald Reagan was a huge proponent of amnesty for illegal immigrants in this country. The English only movement, some Americans protested increased immigration during this time by joining the English only movement. You still see remnants of this today. Members of the group advocated making English the official language of the United States and limiting the use of other languages by government agencies. Most English-only supporters opposed bilingual education in schools because they believed it prevented immigrants from learning English. In the 1980s, several states passed laws establishing English as the official language. Okay. And next slide, final slide for the day, amnesty for illegals. In 1986, Reagan signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which called for stricter immigration controls on the U.S.-Mexico border and severely penalized employers who hired undocumented workers. However, at the same time, the law provided amnesty for 2.8 million immigrants who had entered the country illegally, thus facilitating their path to citizenship. Okay, so something very different about the Republican platform in the 80s than today. All right, so that wraps up our video lecture for today. As always, guys, stay healthy, stay well. I hope you have a wonderful day. Bye.